Well, good evening, everybody, friends, colleagues, and distinguished guests, Fintan and Claire. Welcome, all of you, to the 2024 Edmund Burke Lecture. Delighted to see so many people in the room. My name is Eve Patton. I'm director of the Trinity Long Room Hub, and that's Trinity's Research Institute for the Arts and Humanities. And each year, the Hub hosts the Edmund Burke Lecture, which was set up in honour of Trinity alumnus Padraic Fallon, and I'm very pleased that Gillian Fallon Jr. and friends of the family are with us this evening. This event allows us to welcome to Trinity distinguished speakers who've made some kind of intellectual contribution at an international level. Recent Burke lecturers have included the philosopher and historian Michael Ignatieff in 2022 and the cultural historian Joanna Burke in 2023. I was absolutely delighted when Fintan agreed to give this year's lecture, not only because he fulfills, obviously, the criteria. He is, as you know, a renowned author of far too many books for me to list here, a literary critic and editor, a political commentator, and of course, that rare beast, a public intellectual. But there is one descriptor that I don't want to lose sight of this evening: journalist. Fintan's distinctive style as a journalist, his attention to language, nuance, metaphor, and rhetoric, this is what made his recent book, the award-winning We Don't Know Ourselves, such a vivid account of Ireland's transformation since 1958. As you know, it was supposedly Edmund Burke who coined the term the Fourth Estate to describe the press. And whether he meant it in a derogatory way or not, the Fourth Estate is still with us. The journalist is still at the cornerstone of a critical, functioning, pluralist democracy. If that democracy is currently undergoing a lingering dissolution, the ship of state handed over, as Fintan wrote very recently, to a motley crew of libertines and libertarians, control freaks and fanatics, then surely we must rely on our journalists more than ever to stay with us, to stay live and dangerous. So to give the 2024 Edmund Burke Lecture on terror and self-pity, the reactionary sublime, please join me in welcoming the author, critic, public intellectual, and journalist, Fintan O'Toole.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out on this cold night, for this evening of uplift and cheeriness. My heart sank slightly when he started the sentence, the author of far too many books, but then she continued it, so that was all right, but I probably am the author of far too many books indeed. Walter Benjamin famously wrote in Nazi Rules Berlin that the logical outcome of fascism is an aestheticizing of political life. But we might also put this the other way around. The more political life resembles art, the more fascistic it becomes. We find ourselves at a moment when not only politics, but the whole public realm is thoroughly aestheticized. We're in a world in which those who are fixated on the imaginary, alternative facts, conspiracy theories, paranoid fantasies, AI-generated disinformation are shaping the real world of power. In George Orwell's 1984, Winston Smith scribbles in his diary about a visit to the cinema the previous evening. It's showing actual film of a ship full of refugees being bombed somewhere in the Mediterranean. But this representation of terrible suffering is now completely aestheticized. Winston thinks the film very good. Audience, he notes, much amused by shots of a great, huge, fat man trying to swim away with a helicopter after him. First, you saw him wallowing along in the water like a porpoise. Then you saw him through the helicopter's gun sights. Then he was full of holes and the sea around him turned pink and he sank as suddenly as though the holes had let in the water. Audience shouting with laughter when he sank. In the way Winston writes, the word shots seems to cover the actions both of the guns and of the cameras. In this shrinking of the distance between the aesthetic and the political, there's no room left for the ethical, no space for compassion. There is, however, and this is where we get very cheery, a step even beyond Orwell's bleak dystopian vision. In this passage in 1984, there is still the notion that what is happening to these refugees is real, even if it is then artfully presented as an entertaining spectacle. In today's United States, however, there's a reactionary discourse in which the relationship is reversed. What you think you saw did not happen. It was all an act. Everything is art. In June 2018, for example, when very young children were being separated from their parents at the southern border, Ann Coulter on the mainstream panel show on Fox News addressed the then president and, of course, future President Donald Trump. These child actors weeping and crying on all the other networks 24/7 right now, do not fall for it, Mr. President. These kids are being coached. They're given scripts to read by liberals. Don't fall for the actor children. This child actor conspiracy theory was also applied to mass murders of children in schools, most notoriously to the Sandy Hook massacre in 2012. Another version of the same claim is Tucker Carlson's insistence, also and repeatedly on Fox News, that the violent coup attempt of January the 6th, 2021 was a false flag operation staged by the FBI, a fiction endorsed by Trump and by Senator Ted Cruz, among many other prominent Republican office holders. Here we have perhaps the final stage of the aestheticization of politics. It's a world turned upside down. Reality is all theatre. Victims, even the small children, are sophisticated performers, acting out scripts, weeping on cue. The dead, even the dead children, did not die. The massacre was a movie. Events of great historical import, like those of January 6th, were in fact concocted in some secret writer's room in FBI headquarters, with a deep state dramatist as the showrunner. Conversely, therefore, the truth must be an imaginative construct. It's not out there in the world, but in here, in the untainted minds of the undeceived few. Seeing is disbelieving. Only through belief in the special powers of perception of Trump or Coulter or Carlson or now Elon Musk can we be allowed to glimpse the truth. So one of the paradoxes of our time is that image making has been radically democratized, but the effect is not good for democracy. Back in the 1930s, to go back to that essay, Benjamin believed that one of the sins of commercial cinema was that it deprived the masses of their right to be the stars of their own movies. He regarded the new technologies as having opened up a possibility of liberation. In the case of film, the newsreel demonstrates unequivocally that any individual can be in a position to be filmed. But that possibility is not enough. Any person today can lay claim to being filmed. The problem for him was that, quote, the capitalist exploitation of film obstructs the human being's legitimate claim to being reproduced. If Benjamin had been told that there would be a time in the future when ordinary people would not only have a right to be filmed, but that they themselves would be able to act 20 times a day on their legitimate claim to reproduce themselves, he would have seen this as evidence of a glorious revolution in social relations. He would have imagined that in this future, cultural power had passed to and spread equally among ordinary citizens. But we have seen such a future, and it doesn't quite work like that. The world is saturated with the artful reproduction of our images of ourselves. Curation, a word that used to mean, as the Oxford English Dictionary still has it, the action or work of looking after and preserving the exhibits in a collection, as in a museum, has colonized non-artistic experience. The curation of one's wardrobe, one's friendship groups, above all, one's social media images, is now the approved way to project oneself into the world. The self is a gallery with ever-changing exhibitions. Yet this development has not, as Benjamin imagined it would, freed us from exploitation. These projected selves are owned by the corporations that control the means of distribution. And their vast accumulation seems less an expression of democratic community than a substitute for it. And all of this leaves us, I think, in a strange kind of mental space. Sigmund Freud, in his essay, The Uncanny, which was published in 1919, explains that, I quote, an uncanny effect is often and easily produced by effacing the distinction between imagination and reality, such as when something that we have hitherto regarded as imaginary appears before us in reality. This could be a summation of what we're currently experiencing with climate change and the climate crisis. Something we have hitherto regarded as imaginary, which is to say, existing in the realms of a possible and nebulous future, is precisely appearing before us in reality as floods and storms, heat waves and droughts. The uncanny is now the everyday. What used to be the most banal form of communicative activity, talking about the weather, is now pitched between a past tense of lost opportunities and a future of existential dread. I told you this was going to be fun. In this mental space, an idea once associated with artistic representation has become central to communal life. Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote that which constitutes poetic faith is the creation of a semblance of truth sufficient to procure for shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment. Now, the suspension of disbelief has jumped species. It's no longer a leap of poetic faith in which a small shard of the real allows us as audiences or readers to pretend that shadows of the imagination have substance. It is constitutive of reality itself. And not, you'll be surprised to hear, in good ways. For both in relation to climate change and to the crisis of democracy, the suspension of disbelief has become a form of somnambulism. Benjamin asked whether humanity, quote, reached the point where it can experience its own annihilation as a supreme aesthetic pleasure. The question does not seem absurd. Environmental scientists have put forward the idea that we humans have created through our effects on the atmosphere and climate a new geological epoch and we are now living in what they call the Anthropocene. We've abolished the distinction between nature and culture. The natural world in which we must survive is itself a product of human activity. What I wonder is whether we might have to consider the need for a similar conceptual leap on the smaller scale of politics. For just as the earth has become man-made, just as the atmosphere has become saturated with human effects, we have a democracy whose atmosphere is supersaturated with artfulness. We're living, politically speaking, in the Aestheticized. I've always wanted to get a word into the dictionary, so if you could please do that one, I'd be very happy with that. Which brings us, you might be wondering, when am I going to come to Edmund Burke? But enter Edmund Burke. It's a kind of an interesting moment, I think, in relation to Burke, because what used to be called Burkean conservatism has just sort of melted away like snow in the sun. It's gone. As it disappears before our eyes, those of us who are instinctively critical of it are forced to mourn with Joni Mitchell that you don't know what you've got till it's gone. God, you know, what could we do with some Burkean conservatives around, you know? But if we, what I want to suggest is that if does that make Burke irrelevant? Well, actually, if we are in the Aestheticized, Burke's aesthetics may be at least as relevant and perhaps more so to our moment as his directly political writings. His first book, Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful, perhaps helps to illuminate not just paintings or dramas, but the world of Donald Trump. In this brilliant extended essay, which was written at least in part while he was a student here, Burke sets out to demolish a long tradition of thinking about art as a gateway to great ideas or moral improvement. And I think that alone is one of the things that makes the essay so interesting, right? Because I don't think anybody really believes anymore that art makes us better people, right? It may do all sorts of other things, but the sort of long tradition of thinking about it in this way, you know, as something that kind of created different kinds of more civilized people, it has probably vanished. To quote another Trinity man, Swift, I mean, sweetness and light as the realm of culture, which is, you know, what Swift told us doesn't really seem very convincing. in a world of culture wars, sweetness and light is not really what comes to mind. So Burke in that essay was really trying to think about saying, you know, he was just unconvinced by this idea that that's what art does. And what Burke was interested in was feelings, emotions. What feelings are produced in us by our encounter with a work of art? That's really what he's exploring. And he follows, as pretty much anybody who thinks about this at all would do, the kind of touchstone, the great touchstone is Aristotle's description of the emotions that are purged by tragedy, by Greek tragedy, right? Which, of course, Aristotle says are terror and pity. And Burke's sort of originality is to sort of, in a way, go back to those two things, to terror and pity, and to try to sort of winnow them out from each other, you know, to think about them as sort of productive of different kinds of emotions when we're encountering a work of art. And his essay is particularly potent in thinking about the first part of this, right? So his great originality really is in thinking about terror and thinking about this paradox, which is, you know, why do we get pleasure from terrifying works of art? So he separates them out. He says terror is a passion which always produces delight when it does not press too close. And pity is a passion accompanied with pleasure because it arises from love and social affection. Right? So he's trying to think about these two things differently. And to this emotion of terror, he gives the name the sublime. We often use this term now to talk about, oh, that cake was just sublime, but he's not really, that's not what he means, right? He says terror is in all cases whatsoever, either more openly or latently, the ruling principle of the sublime. So this is what he's trying to deal with. And so these categories, which he kind of draws from Aristotle, terror and pity, he kind of reshapes as the sublime and the beautiful. Now, I might take a guess and say it's unlikely that Donald Trump has read Burke, but I do think, and I'm really quite serious about this, that he has successfully adapted these categories to create a potent form of aestheticized reactionary politics. I mean, Trump called himself a very stable genius. I don't think the first part of that is necessarily true, but we have to acknowledge that he has a kind of instinctive genius for understanding how to create a different kind of politics. Burke writes that, I know of nothing sublime which is not some modification of power. But we might now add that Trump's power is a modification of the sublime. Okay, so first, what is the sublime? Let's just go back a little bit to what Burke he tells us about this category that he's kind of defining for us. So Burke's great insight, and he's, unlike me, he's far too polite to put it this way, is that there's a kind of sadomasochistic delight in certain kinds of art. Right? Why do we choose to subject ourselves to horror movies or serial killer thrillers or Oedipus putting out his own eyes or Gloucester having his eyes gouged out on stage by Cornwall in King Lear? And Burke has an answer to this. So he suggests that we do this because pleasure is not some kind of steady state of bliss, innocent bliss. It's experienced most intensely as pain avoided. Right? So Burke's idea here really, he kind of starts at the back, basically where he doesn't have evolutionary biology, but he's kind of thinking of that in a way, which is almost like we're programmed for self-preservation. And so the evocation of pain and terror produces very powerful emotion in us, and then if that's sort of avoided, that produces pleasure. So this is Burke's definition of the sublime. He says, whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger. That is to say, whatever is in any sort terrible, or is conversant about terrible objects, or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is a source of the sublime. That is, it is productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. I say the strongest emotion because I am satisfied the ideas of pain are much more powerful than those which enter on the part of pleasure. Without all doubt, the torments which we may be made to suffer are much greater in their effect on the body and mind than any pleasures which the most learned voluptuary, I'm sure this room is full of learned voluptuaries, could suggest. Right? So what Burke is telling us is that the effect of the sublime, as he's defining it, is not so much, as Aristotle has it, the purging of terror, as this paradoxical experience of terror in a context of safety. I think this is this is where the politics comes into play. Right? So Burke is not so stupid as to think that we get pleasure from actually being confronted with things that are possibly going to kill us, right? Or from actually being subjected to pain in a physical sense. He says, when danger or pain press too nearly, they're incapable of giving any delight and are simply terrible. But at certain distances and with certain modifications, they may be and they are delightful as we every day experience. Right? So he's interested in distance and modification as ways of producing through terror aesthetic pleasure. Right? And really this is, I've been trying to write about this for a while, in different ways, but contemporary reactionary politics is a politics of pain. Right? Pain invoked, pain distanced, pain rendered politically delightful. This was true of Brexit, which depended on the evocation of an idea of Britain, in fact, a free and prosperous country, as enslaved and oppressed by the European Union. It doesn't seem to me to be entirely beside the point that by far the biggest selling work of British fiction in the couple of years leading up to Brexit was 50 Shades of Grey. But seriously, it's also very much true of Trump, right? So before Trump, American political rhetoric, certainly successful American political rhetoric, including conservative rhetoric, had a grammar of uplift. The American dream, Kennedy's new frontier, Reagan's morning in America, Obama's arc of history bending towards justice. What made Trump different, and what made most people when they saw him originally feel this guy's never, ever going to get elected, right? There's no chance, was because from the very beginning, he was aggressively confronting that rhetoric of uplift. So really from the start, from 2015, Trump went for the full sublime. He created a vision of America as a hellhole, which, or what he called in his first inaugural address, American carnage. He imagined the country for his fans as a place on the verge of obliteration, and this is what he has continued to do. If I don't win the election, he warned in 2020, China will own the United States. You are going to have to learn to speak Chinese. In this year's campaign, he claimed that Kamala Harris, quote, wants to abolish the suburbs. Right? It's not just, threaten your life in the suburbs, but abolish the suburbs. Right? And remember, he launched his campaign, his, as it turns out, successful campaign to be elected as president this time, with a rally in Waco, Texas. Right? And some of you are haggard and old enough to remember the significance of Waco, Texas, right? As the place that literally went down in flames. It was the headquarters of the apocalyptic cult, the Branch Davidians, that was attacked by government forces in 1993, and you had this kind of horrific fire in which everybody died. And in his speech launching his campaign, right, this is the beginning of why he should be re-elected, Trump drew on a text that is familiar to most of his fan base, which after all, at the core of his fan base are evangelical Christians, the Book of Revelation. 2024, he said, is the final battle. Right? That has kind of... Steve Bannon, Trump's intellectual, I suppose we must call him, joked at the time that they were the Trump Davidians. Right? That sort of... So, but it's not that funny, actually. It's a very deliberate evocation of terror. You know. And then if you look at what Trump did in the election campaign, he again instinctively reversed his rhetoric, right? When Kamala Harris, suddenly became the candidate. Trump's typical rhetoric is all about belittling, both metaphorically but also literally. He makes other men into little men, little Marco. And you would think the obvious thing to do with a woman was to belittle her even more. But instead, his instinct was, no, that doesn't work for terror. You've got to do something else. So he inflated Harris. He made her into a monstrous figure. He turned her into a Medusa, a Scylla, a Grendel. And his most effective performative strategy was to conjoin the monster Harris, the female monster, with the monstrous alien immigrants who were in the dark hallucination that he wanted to engender, streaming across the southern border to invade American homes and murder and rape their occupants, and even worse, eat their cats and dogs. Now, this was sort of constant, and there's a phrase that came out, I don't know who invented it, but sane washing, where there's a tendency almost by journalists, because we're trained to try to make sense, to communicate to people, so of sort of playing down almost the sheer kind of wildness of Trump's rhetoric. But this sort of fusion of, in a way it's simple enough strategy, right? Harris is a mythical monster. She is manifesting this monstrosity by purposefully unleashing vast numbers of murderers and rapists, dark-skinned murderers and rapists, of course, on American women. Now, again, you almost have to admire the boldness of this strategy, right? So a man who has been found guilty of being a rapist by a jury of his peers, right, is actually using rape as the terror that he wants to exploit, right? It sort of takes an astonishing level of shamelessness, to do this, but he could pull it off, right? So, and I think I just want to emphasize here is his sense of scale, right? So it's this idea of something which is almost too big to be imagined. Again, instead of belittling, it's just kind of creating this enormous scale of monstrosity. So in a Truth Social post on September 27th, based on a completely wild distortion of figures, surprisingly, so the figure in fact refers to a 40-year period in America, including Trump's own presidency, Trump's own 4 years of that, so he's got 10% of that. But he wrote that Comrade Kamala Harris allowed almost 14,000 murderers, capitalized, to freely and openly roam our country. And people are dying every day because of her. And then big capitals. She has got blood on her hands. Right? So you've got this kind of, it's not sophisticated in a way, but instinctively sort of brilliant, where you're personalizing it. Harris as an individual is this individual monster. But then you've got these 14,000 murderers and rapists who are her agents, whom she is unleashing. Right? So that's the strategy. And of course, going back to Trump's biblically inclined followers, this image of her with the blood on her hands, unleashing all of this terror, surely evoked the whore of Babylon from the book of Revelation. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. So this monstrous woman drunken on blood, is what he's evoking. And Trump managed to do this. He pulled it off. He successfully identified Harris, who was trying to do joy and smiling on all occasions, with her rampaging army of killers and rapists. In his telling, she was them. Their actions were hers, and together they created a monstrosity beyond the audience's collective imagination. This was not an allegation, right? So this is not old-fashioned politics where you're making an allegation against your opponent. This is terror. This is an aesthetic evocation of terror. Right? So he's doing exactly what a dramatist would do, which is to embody in an individual all of these vast invisible forces of terror. Right? But it's terror, we'll come back to Burke, modified and modulated with an instinctive brilliance. So Burke writes of the terror of the sublime that the nearer it approaches to reality and the further it removes us from all idea of fiction, the more perfect is its power. But be its power of what kind it will, it never approaches to what it represents. Right? So effectively what he's saying is the most effective kind of sublime terror is the one that takes you very close to a sense of reality, but also makes sure that you don't touch the reality. Because if you touch the reality, then it just becomes actual terror and not this sort of pleasurable release or emotion. And this is the trick. It has to actually come very close to reality. And you can take an example of there's a TV ad that the Trump campaign aired nearly 6,000 times in just 6 days in late October. They spent $20 million on it. And it just has a voice which is exactly the voice you hear when you go to a trailer for a horror movie, that male voice. And it's intoning, and then you get real mugshots, right? So actual criminals, dark-skinned criminals, right? And then you get the pictures of real women who were victims, right? So you get just the reality. And the voice does this thing of that, very much in tune with what Trump's doing, which is sort of making the horror almost unimaginable by kind of multiplying it. And so you've got these very large numbers of faces that you can't quite fix on any one of them. And then the voice says that the women, when you see the women, it says they were bludgeoned, raped, strangled, stabbed, shot, and murdered. Right? It's almost pathetically comic, in the sense of, literal overkill is what we're dealing with there, right? So, but it's as though each one of these, and these are real women, remember, have been killed several times, right? So it's not just bad enough that they were murdered once, it's this repetition. And slaughtered, of course, the implication is by Kamala Harris, right? Kamala Harris, murdered these women over and over again. It doesn't actually say this last bit, and this, as Burke would have it, the sublime never actually reaches all the way to what it represents. So what's unseen and unrepresented is Kamala Harris, the murderer, right? But it did, again, as Burke would say, remove its imagery from all idea of fiction. It doesn't feel like it's fiction because you've got these real pictures. So this is art. This is a kind of artfulness, right? It's crude, but it's very effective. Because the invented monstrosity is embedded in reality. But, and this is the key thing, Trump doesn't merely terrorize his audience. He does exactly what Burke recognizes in the sublime. Terror is a passion which produces delight when it does not press too close. So Trump offers his fans the thrill of this overwhelming, mind-numbing dread, but also a profound awareness of safety. This is the paradox, right? Why is the mass rally Trump's signature arena? Again, his instinct in sort of reconvening what seems like a very old-fashioned, clapped-out, outdated form of doing politics. Right? And I think it's because It provides a literal safety in numbers, right? A protected zone in which the faithful do not have to encounter the infidel or the threat. One of the dramas of Trump rallies, of course, early on was physically beating up and throwing out people, getting rid of the danger, who were just, of course, citizens protesting or whatever. But the whole drama of the way in which Trump presented these things was kind of a sort of double distancing. So first, the sources of terror are external invaders. There are apparently no rapists or murderers indigenous to America. Right? Trump would never, ever speaks about any crime committed by an indigenous American on another indigenous American. Right? So the terror is external. And then there's the second act of distancing, which is the reassurance of salvation. Right? So Trump is protector, savior, the force field shielding the women of America from their otherwise inevitably horrific fate, as he put it himself, whether they like it or not. Right? Now, at the heart of this maneuver is this appeal to an instinct that Burke identifies as part of the sublime, as I mentioned, self-preservation. Right? You have to vote for me to preserve your own life. It's sort of almost kind of evolutionary biology at work, right? But what Burke helps to illuminate for us further is that the idea of self-preservation is a pleasure precisely when we sort of don't need it, right? It can only be a pleasure if we're actually also simultaneously aware of the fact that we're really not being threatened. We're really safe, because otherwise it's real terror, right? It's not this aestheticized terror. The passions, Burke says, which belong to self-preservation turn on pain and danger. They are simply painful when their causes immediately affect us. They are delightful when we have an idea of pain and danger without being actually in such circumstances. Right? So those of us who are sort of literal-minded, are thinking, well, surely Trump's audience, do they believe that their lives are in immediate danger from this horde of Kamala Harris-led migrants? Or do they not believe it? And in fact, of course, what Trump's doing, and this is why it is quite sophisticated, right, is doing both at the same time, right? Is evoking this absolute terror, but doing so with a cordon around it, which says, but actually you're safe. We know this because it simply couldn't work otherwise, right? The whole dynamic, and this is where I think Burke is very illuminating. The dynamic of this couldn't work if you actually believe you're in danger. Trump's fans would not take pleasure, and they clearly take huge pleasure in his performances, without this suspension of disbelief. And so what Trump's done is he's kind of politicized the suspension of disbelief, in a very potent way. It's actually the relative safety of America, a country in which, of course, crime rates have actually been falling. This is the key to it. If crime rates were not actually falling, oddly enough, it would not be quite as easy for Trump to invoke the idea of American carnage, right? In a pleasurable way. Because the audience, as Burke would say, would not find it delightful if they were actually in such circumstances. They cannot truly believe in the apocalyptic vision of impending annihilation. Rather, as I said, they suspend their disbelief in it. Now, there's another aspect of the sublime of Trump's sublime that Burke helps us to illuminate. The great mystery of Trump, for those of us who are not, and I know maybe at least half the audience here are not Trump fans, But those of us who are not in his psychological orbit find it very, very difficult to understand a very simple thing, right? Which is how do people not associate his increasing crazy rambling with just an old man losing it? Right? Why does it not translate as cognitive deterioration? Why, in other words, were Joe Biden's struggles to make sense politically disqualifying, right? Biden could not run for president after the debate in which it was clear that he was not fully in charge of his mental faculties, was not fully sharp. Whereas Trump's extremely weird animadversions on everything from Arnold Palmer's penis to the greatness of the fictional serial killer and cannibal Hannibal Lecter were not disqualifying. Why does that not come across as senility, to put it crudely? Trump, after all, presented to the electorate not just his ego, but his id. His public utterances were increasingly like a version of Ulysses written by someone on a bad acid trip. His stream of consciousness was more like a meander of unconsciousness. Random thoughts would surface. I mean, it's really fascinating to watch. You can watch all these things online. You watch the full rally, and unless you really watch it, you didn't really get the full sense of just the sheer strangeness of a lot of this stuff. I'm going to give you an example. I'm not going to try and do Donald Trump during this, but so one of his things, he did this more than once. So this is the performative side of it. So a lot of a Trump rally is about Trump reenacting. Right? So he's not just acting; he's reenacting. He says, "And I said this, and I did this, and then I did," and it's all, something that I encountered, and now I'm playing it out for you again. It is sort of theatrical performance. And one of the things he talks about is this encounter he had with a guy who makes boats in South Carolina somewhere, right? So I said, "Let me ask you a question." And the guy said, "Nobody ever asked this question. And it must be because of MIT, my relationship to MIT. Very smart." He goes, I say, "What would happen if the boat sank from its weight and you're in the boat and you have this tremendously powerful battery and the battery is now underwater and there's a shark that's approximately 10 yards over there? A lot of shark attacks lately. Do you notice that? I watched some guys justifying it today. Well, they weren't really that angry. They just bit off the young lady's leg because of the fact that they were not hungry, but they misunderstood who she was. These people are crazy." I mean, that's actual, I've actually cut out some of the ellipses, but that's a kind of text, right? Now, so again, Burke really helps us here because Burke tells us that in the sublime state of mind, clarity is not only not required, it's not even desirable, right? In reality, Burke writes, a great clearness helps but little towards affecting the passions, as in some sort an enemy to all enthusiasms whatsoever. What Burke's kind of saying is that you don't get sort of this emotional enthusiasm about things that are clear. Obscurity, Burke says, is an essential aspect of the terror that generates sublime feelings. To make anything very terrible, obscurity seems in general to be necessary. When we know the full extent of any danger, when we can accustom our eyes to it, a great deal of the apprehension vanishes. So the apprehension, the terror, is actually to do with incomprehension. It's to do with not being able to follow this stuff. Trump's speeches fit Burke's description. All is dark, uncertain, confused, terrible, and sublime to the last degree. That's Burke. Could there be a better summation of the effects of attending a Trump rally than the following sentence of Burke's? The mind is hurried out of itself by a crowd of great and confused images, which affect because they are crowded and confused. Interestingly, Burke even makes a passing suggestion about colours and the sublime. He says that among colours such as are soft or cheerful are unfit to produce grand images. And these are the grand images he thinks will be sublime. And therefore they're not capable of producing sublime effects. But he has a little parenthesis where he suggests there's one exception to this rule. He says, except perhaps a strong red, which is cheerful. So he foresaw apparently the colour of the MAGA hat. So much for the sublime. So what about the other half of Burke's aesthetic pairing, the beautiful? It's very striking that the most common word that Trump uses in his rhetoric is beautiful. Right? So as well as evoking terror, he's continually using this word beautiful. Somebody calculated, I have to admit I didn't do it myself, but in 2017, a journalist worked out that in the course of just 1 month of public appearances, Trump described 35 separate things or people as beautiful. He uses it about himself. My temperament is totally controlled, so beautiful. You turn on the shower, if you're like me, you can't wash your beautiful hair properly. This is because of the environmentalists, taking away the energy. If you took this shirt off, you'd see a beautiful, beautiful person. That's Trump, by the way, not me. He uses it about coal. We've ended the war on clean, beautiful coal. Fighter jets, those brand new, beautiful planes, those incredible stealth F-35s. He uses it about letters he received from both North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and President Xi Jinping of China. He used it about our own RTE reporter, Katrina Perry. He used it about chocolate cake, the US Supreme Court, probably in a similar kind of vein. Our beautiful American tax dollars, farming, the White House telephones, Confederate monuments, his healthcare plan, his own sentences before they are cruelly edited, apparently, by newspapers. You'll have this beautiful flowing sentence where the back of the sentence reverts to the front and they cut the back of the sentence off. Tariffs, most recently, he said the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff. Right? And he also used it about Belgium. Belgium is a beautiful city, he said. I was hoping to kind of cheer us up and say, well, progressives can maybe take some comfort from Burke's discussion of the beautiful as opposed to the sublime. He suggests that while our pleasure in the sublime is that of the thought of pain promoted by terror, our pleasure in beauty, on the contrary, is linked to our capacity for love. By beauty, I mean, he writes, that quality or those qualities in bodies by which they cause love or some passion similar to it. Beauty for Burke is a social emotion. This is the pity part of the terror and pity coupling. Pity is a passion accompanied with pleasure because it arises from love and social affection. Well, love and social affection were the keynotes of Kamala Harris's campaign. In this sense, we might say that she instinctively tried to counter the Trumpian sublime with the beautiful, to evoke a pity that would be at least as emotionally potent as Trump's terror. But the bad news is that there's a variant on pity not imagined by either Aristotle or Burke, which is self-pity. The attenuation of empathy into self-pity is one of the primary tools of reactionary politics. Democracy depends on a lot of things, but one of the vaguest yet most vital is what we might call fellow feeling. The emotional life of democracy is sustained by a basic sense of mutual compassion. We want our fellow citizens to do well, and if they're not doing well, we say in the formula that we use at Irish funerals, I'm sorry for your trouble. And we maybe somewhat mean it. And critically, we expect them to feel the same way about us, right? It's a mutual contract. I don't think this sense of empathy has disappeared from our democracies, and I don't think we should cease fighting for it. But reactionary tribalized politics has found a way of turning it inwards. Trump's constant use of mockery, for example, reminds us, again, to go back to Sigmund Freud, that jokes can be a way of shutting down pity by identifying those who are being laughed at as the ones who are not worth pitying. A saving of pity, says Freud, is one of the most frequent sources of humorous pleasure. Trump's appeal draws on his ability to be pitiless in his ridicule of the targets of his contempt, while allowing his audience to feel deeply sorry for itself. If tragedy, as Aristotle claimed, involves terror and pity, Trump's tragicomedy deals in terror and self-pity. Thank you very much.